never forgave him for his role in that general strike. Never breached that chasm. Although we had on and off good relationships over the years. I persuaded them to send me to France to purportedly to go to lycée, equivalent of high school, but I talked to myself and the University of Paris to accept me as a university student, because in France then, and I think today, as long as you can pass the exams, they don't care how old you are, which is, of course, a much better system than what they had in England, and certainly what we have in the United States. So we're now 1936 and 7. Hitler is 3 years in power and very politically active. I considered going to Spain to fight for the Spanish government in the Spanish Civil War, which was roughly, I say, equivalent to the Vietnam War. It was one of those dividing moments. You either were for or against the loyalist, the socialist Spanish government, or for General Franco, fascist general, who was supported by Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and tacitly by the United States and the United Kingdom, refused, both of which refused to support the democratically elected socialist Spanish government, Republican government. I did not go to Spain, mostly out of cowardice. I was 16, a bit young, but a number of my older friends did go and fight for the loyalists. We lost, as you know, and it was very clear to those of us on the left wing in particular that there would be a war against the fascists. And so I perfected my French and in the summer of 1937, I would have normally, nothing in life is, quote, normal, but had I not known or thought that there would be a world war, I would have probably stayed in France. I preferred living in Paris in particular to living in London for a number of reasons. But I decided to learn German so that I would have at least 2 languages, although my Latin was very good. And I did know Yiddish from my mother, who spoke Yiddish on the telephone most evenings with her sisters.
Okay.
My father, being Sephardic, understood Ladino and was very unhappy when he heard my mother talking Yiddish. In any event, I did get in enough time at the University of Vienna to get pretty fluent in German, and decided, because it was clearer and clearer, that there would be what the Germans call Anschluss, takeover by the German Nazis of first of all Austria, then the Sudetenland, then Czechoslovakia. That war was now unavoidable, even though Winston Churchill called World War II the unavoidable war. This is not generally quoted, but I do have the source. In any event, I was torn between my anti-fascism on the one hand as a socialist. I member of the British Student Labour University Labour Federation in London. Never joined or wanted to join the Communist Party because it became very clear that they were dominated by the Stalinists from Moscow.
Okay.
We had no illusions about that, but the Spanish, the Soviet initially did support the loyalists in Spain. I won't go into a long history of that, but I decided to come back in 1938. I was now 17, 18. I could get into University of London. Excuse me. I may have to take this call.
Oh, that's fine.
I mean, I have to take it, but
No, take your time. That's fine.
It's going to be a long interview.
That's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Well,
I think it's pretty
relevant to me.
Important stuff. I mean,
yeah.
38 and you're 18 years old. You're back in London.
I go to London University, number one, because they take students 1 year younger than Oxford or Cambridge, and also as a leftist, I just felt that London University at that time was more interesting, and indeed it was. I had some pretty good mentors, one of whom was Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, pacifist. So I was torn between. I had a next door neighbor to where my parents, not next door, but a couple of blocks away. A friend at University College London from India, who was a Brahmin, whose name was Indra Chatterjee, great Indian Brahmin name. His cousin, who lived round the corner, also from my parents, was Indira Nehru. So I got to know her quite early in my life, and through the two of them, I worked at London University for Indian independence with Krishna Menon and occasional visits from Gandhiji came to London. So I was strongly influenced by pacifism, torn now between my anti-fascism, however, and particularly knowing that the war could have been avoided, could have called Hitler's bluff. America, or Britain and France and America failed to call Hitler's bluff over his occupation of the Rhineland and series of steps that were totally ignored or condoned by the French and the British and the Americans, who were, after all, making a lot of money selling arms and material to Nazi Germany. What is not generally known, Standard Oil, for example, even after the outbreak of World War II, September 3, 1939, both Standard Oil, many other American and British companies, including IBM, continued to sell their, continued to trade with Nazi Germany.
I see.
The whole system of documenting the Holocaust, for example, was done on the IBM Hollerith card system. This is, again, not widely advertised by IBM.
That's what's happening?
Yes. So this is war. never as clean cut as the propagandists tell us. In any event, I did get a 1-year deferment because I was to finish my my English degree in linguistics, BA, at London University. But in May 1940, I'm now 20 years old, I get a letter from His Majesty's government inviting me to present myself to Royal Artillery Base Depot in Blackdown. I got what was called the King's Shilling, which I think in those days was a pound note. In any event, I was what in England's called up, and I went into the Royal Artillery. I have a chapter. I've written a book called A Different Kind of War, where a lot of what I'm talking about now is described. And maybe we could save a bit of time if I sent you some of those chapters.
Absolutely.
Because I am, in effect, summarizing them. I had at school, I had been in something in Britain that's called OTC, the Officer Training Corps, I think, OTC. And I learned the basics of arms drill, and more importantly, along with my so-called public school accent, I was able to, after a few trials and tribulations, after about 3 months in basic training, of course, this is after the British retreat from Dunkirk, just historically, where 300,000 British troops were forced to disembark or escape from France when the Wehrmacht, the German army, took over in May of 1940. In any event, because of my accent and leadership and the OTC training, I qualified for officer training, which was called OCTU, Officer Cadet. I was sent to a very cold winter of 1940 to Wales for I think it was a 3-month officer training. I qualified and started off as a second lieutenant. Because it was so cold, and for other reasons, London was now being bombed by the Luftwaffe, and my parents were right in the middle of it, and so was the barracks where I was stationed as an artillery officer, Royal Artillery anti-aircraft officer, was also bombed. I volunteered for overseas duties because I thought, number one, it would take some time getting there, wherever there was. We didn't know. I surmised it would be Egypt, Middle East, and it was. So I had in early March, I had a 6-week trip around, across the North Atlantic to Halifax, Nova Scotia, down the South Atlantic to Sierra Leone, round the Cape of Good Hope, a couple of days in Cape Town, eventually up to the Red Sea, Suez Canal, and I report to the Royal Artillery depot in Cairo, Egypt. on May 5th, 1941, which happened to be my 21st birthday.
And what was the purpose of that? Oh, that whole trip?
Well, it was the only way the British could get troops. Britain was fighting at that point the Africa Corps in Cyrenaica, Egypt. Eventually taken over by Rommel. And of course this was 6 months before Pearl Harbor, and Britain was fighting alone, except in the June of 1941, shortly after I arrived in Cairo, Hitler made the monumental mistake of Operation Barbarossa, June 22, 1941, of invading the Soviet Union, which led to his downfall and the defeat of the German army, which otherwise we'd still be fighting, or we would have lost World War. That's another whole other story. In any event, I'm about 2 weeks in Cairo at the base, artillery base depot, waiting for assignment to what was called the Desert Rats, the British force fighting against the Africa Corps, which became the British Eighth Army. On the bulletin board one day is a notice saying secret mission, handwritten notice on a kind of postcard, a bit odd. Secret mission, knowledge of French, good knowledge of French essential. So naturally, I volunteered for that because I figured French got to be somewhere other than Rommel, because Africa Corps is German, and I'm basically a coward and looking for a soft, cozy way out. But in any event, I applied and was sent to Jerusalem in then British mandated Palestine for an interview with a Scottish major who spoke French, not quite as well as I did, and who didn't tell me very much, but he seemed to like my accent and my English accent as well as my French. And he hired me, if that's the word, into what was in fact MI6, British intelligence. Mm-hmm. He didn't tell me what for, but I had to report about 10 days later, after going back to Cairo to pick up my stuff, had to report to Nazareth. Turned out that Churchill was planning a preemptive invasion of Lebanon and Syria to coordinate with what he knew would be the invasion of the Soviet Union I referred to earlier. We're now early June 1941, so 3 weeks or so later, thanks to British breaking the Nazi codes under the Enigma system, Churchill knew that, number one, the Germans would invade Soviet Union, and secondly, that the Red Army was extremely poorly organized at that stage because Stalin had done a lot of purges of so-called Jews and others, and that the Hitler's intention was not only to capture Moscow, but to advance into, because of the anticipated poor resistance by the Russians, to move through the Caucasus into, guess where? What we called then Mesopotamia, but Syria, Iraq, for the oil that the Nazis desperately needed. Those oil fields were at that time in British hands, and so there was to be, as I say, a preemptive so-called liberation of Lebanon and Syria, because that was en route from Russia to the oil field. And my job as an agent for MI6 was to, first of all, get myself a civilian double-breasted gray flannel suit made overnight, and other what we call civvy clothes, and prepare myself for going into Vichy French-occupied southern Lebanon to make contact through my French speaking. I was disguised, or took on the role of Jean Bernard, because it sounded a bit like my own name, Swiss journalist. I speak French with a slightly sort of slow, I am bilingual, but I don't have a Parisian accent. Sounds a bit more like somebody from Geneva, I was told. I was introduced to a Arab-Jewish smuggler on a kibbutz in northern Palestine, whose name was Eli Cohen, looking like an Arab, actually wearing a red tarbouche. I do have a photograph of him somewhere. He was a smuggler, so he knew how to he knew all the customs people, and the frontier was very poorly guarded. So again, all this is described in my book, so I won't go into details. I did confirm fairly rapidly what I surmised was that, yes, of course, the French Vichy forces, who were in fact Senegalese mercenaries, commanded by Vichy French officers. Vichy France, of course, was pro-German, pro-Nazi, and the Vichy French the French, number one, historically don't like and trust the English to begin with. They call us perfidious Albion, going back historically to other wars. So I discovered from talking in a brothel to a member of the French Foreign Legion, actually, that, yes, the French Vichy would resist being, quote, liberated, unquote, by the Australians who Churchill had sent to northern Palestine, Australian 7th Division in particular. So I was attached to the Australians, who didn't like the Brits either, by the way, called us pommies. And Churchill had, first of all, Churchill had sent these Aussies were pretty much all volunteers. Their fathers had been sent to Gallipoli by none other than much younger Winston Churchill in World War One. So I wasn't initially terribly well received by the Aussies, but they obviously depended on my information gathering, and I didn't realize the risk that I was taking, and it was short duration. In any event, when I came back and I reported back to the general in command of the Australian forces that were planning to invade, the Aussie general accused me of cowardice, even because Churchill wanted me to go in front of the Australian troops, in front of the Australian infantry, and work as an unusual word I learned at that time, parlementaire. In the medieval times, you sent a parliamentarian in front of the army to negotiate with the enemy with a white flag, which is actually fairly civilized. Yeah. Unless you do this, we will do that. So I had to write a speech of liberation that I knew would be rejected by the Vichy. But I had no choice other than to go and do this. So on, I think it was June 6 or 7, I went back into Lebanon, pretty much the same route to the same small town called Medjayun, where I had been the week earlier. Literally in front of the first company of Australian infantry that was going to, quote, liberate Lebanon and Syria. Another Australian division was further north. And I knew, of course, that the French would not accept my stated terms. So I got trapped out there in front of in no man's land. Again, I won't go into details because all this is written. But I then worked, I'll fast forward a bit, I became, curiously, in a way, I got accepted by the Australian general. I was appointed political advisor to him. So I helped negotiate the occupation, town by village of South Lebanon, explaining to the local muhtars, mayors, that the Aussies would not rape their wives and daughters, which they didn't, and that we came as friends, which more or less we did.